So if you remember last week, we talked a little bit about John the Baptist and that his proclamation of his birth actually comes before Jesus's in Luke's gospel. And if you were going into that story clean, without any sort of expectation about who was who, your initial interpretation would probably be that John was going to be the important one because he was born to the important family, and the prophecy of his birth came in the most important of places, which was, of course, the holiest place in the Temple of Israel. As we know, because we are all great biblical scholars today, that's not how it turned out. That it's actually Mary's son, Jesus, who becomes really the central character in not just Luke's Gospels, but all of the Gospels, and in fact all of the New Testament. But it's not that John doesn't have an important role to play. And Luke especially seems to know that, and so Luke spends a lot more time than anybody else does talking about John and where John comes from, because what Luke realizes is that without John's work and what John will do, Jesus' work will actually be a whole lot more difficult, because John is the one who was tasked to prepare the way. In many ways, sometimes in Scripture, it's alluded to is that John's task is really to, till the fields, right? You can grow stuff in a field without tilling it, but it's a lot harder and it doesn't work as well, right? It's really handy if the ground is disturbed and it's made ready for what's going to come. That becomes John's ministry in all of this, and probably why he gets to be 6 months older than Jesus. So John is born into this family, as we heard. He's born into this important family, as we heard. He's surrounded by people and villages, and obviously his parents have friends, and they're very excited because they have a child now, which is a big deal because they didn't have one before, and children are important back then. Not that they're not important today. You've called me out about that before. But because they played in a certain role back then, because your children would inherit what you had, right? And so John and Elizabeth, or Zachariah and Elizabeth, obviously have some things and no children to pass it on to. So not only do they have a child, but they have a son, is a good thing. Except then we get to verse 80, where apparently very early in his life, John is either sent off or wanders off into the wilderness, where he lives there, apart from his parents, apart from the village that celebrated his birth, and obviously not in a capacity to inherit anything from Zachariah or Elizabeth. And in fact, Zachariah and Elizabeth disappear from the story at this point. We're not sure what happened to them. John's destiny is different, and he first and foremost is going to live a different life than most other people. Instead of living around everyone else as everyone else does, John's going to be taken away. He's going to live in the wilderness. He's going to live primarily on his own. And when he shows up many, many, many years later, John is going to act and dress and be very different than everybody else. First and foremost, John's going to be a little bit of an object of curiosity. Who is this wild man wearing these funny clothes, eating this funny diet, coming out of the wilderness, who we have not seen in years, and what is this message that he is talking about, and who is this person that he is talking about? If you skip ahead past the Christmas story into Luke's chapter 3, you find that John shows up at the scene and he starts immediately doing what he was called to do, which is preparing the way for Jesus. And the way that he does that is he makes himself a little bit of a spectacle. He makes himself a curiosity that people want to know about, because again, this is the day before like television and radio, and if you want to watch curious people doing curious things, you cannot just simply turn on the Kardashians. Right? That's not an option. You have to go to where they are. So John does that, and he's by the river, and he tracks so many people. He also attracts the religious leaders of the day. And then he has this great line where these religious leaders come out, who are, of course, the really important and powerful people of the day. And, of course, what does he do? He calls them a brood of vipers, right? Which is a rather provocative thing to do. That's not generally how one goes about things if one's trying to make friends. So John is able to do what he does, and in fact, only able to do what he does, because first and foremost, people recognize that he is acting different than most people act. He is behaving in a different way, and people want to know and get curious about what it is that is going on. Generally speaking, the religious leaders do not leave the religious places just to see some random guy standing by the side of the road unless they're really, really curious about it. We've talked several times in the church that one of my fundamental beliefs that being curious is our superpower, right? The ability to be curious and learn about things and ask questions about things is our superpower. And so thus the ability to make others curious, John's ability to invoke curiosity in other people quite clearly is his superpower. Now, this, of course, very logically leads us to the movie Elf. When I put these two together, I'm like, what was I thinking? But then I realized what I was thinking, because that was many months ago. So if you don't know the movie Elf, that's fine. It's fine. It's a cute little movie. But in the movie Elf, the basic premise is that there's an orphan child who accidentally finds their way into Santa's sack of toys and gets brought back to the North Pole. And they're at the North Pole, Santa decides, for reasons that are not abundantly clear, to not return the child. Sort of makes him a kidnapper, but that's okay. But instead, raise this child, name him Buddy, because that was what was written on his diaper. They name him Buddy, and they decide to raise them as an elf, which is fine until it's not fine. And of course, what's not fine about it is this right here, is that people get to be a whole lot taller and bigger than elves. So the first part of the movie is a fun little hijinks that ensue when somebody who's really an over 6 foot man is being raised with a bunch of people that are clearly supposed to be under 3 feet tall. And it's funny, right? And so somewhere along the way, when Buddy gets to be an adult, they decide to finally break to news to him that the person he thinks is his father really isn't his father, and that he has another father, and that's a human father. And that father, of course, lives in New York City because all the movies take place in New York City. Because that's how it works. And of course, he also works at the Empire State Building, because where else would you work if you work in New York City? Apparently, that's the only place there is. And I won't really ruin too much of the film, but Buddy goes on this journey, and he goes back to find his dad. And of course, he meets his dad, and believe it or not, his dad is not someone who you would say is full of the Christmas spirit. Right? He is not someone who seems to be a lot full of a lot of grace and love. He's someone who seems to be preoccupied with his work to the point that preoccupation puts his family kind of in second-tier status. And this is obviously the way that they have been living for a good long time. And Buddy's dad especially is not looking to change it. The problem comes when Buddy shows up. They discover that he is, in fact, his son, long lost, who he did not even know he had, which in and of itself would be disruptive. But as you can imagine, somebody who was raised at the North Pole to be an elf would have a different way of being in the world, right? He would talk different, which he does. He would act different, which he does. He eats very, very different food that would very, very clearly give you diabetes instantly. You cannot eat that much maple syrup. Do not try. He behaves in a different way. He has a different set of values. He has a different way of thinking. And of course, all of that is steeped in this idea for him about Christmas and what Christmas means and the importance of family and the importance of love. And so it's interesting, as you might expect, to watch this person go through the streets of New York City and all the inevitable hijinks that must ensue there, which do. The movie works, and it's interesting and it's funny. And it works because Buddy is so clearly different than everybody else. What he stands for, what he cares about, what he speaks about, where he spends his time, where he spends his energy, is very different than everyone else seems to, and people cannot help but take notice. And so Buddy, of course, meets a girl because there has to be a girl in the movie, because otherwise it wouldn't be a movie, right? So there's got to be a girl in a love story. And of course, the girl at first is like, I don't know what's up with this crazy man. But of course, she comes around. And of course, the father at first is resistant and doesn't really sure what to do with this guy and doesn't really sure he wants this person in his life. And then, of course, as the movie goes on and time progresses, his heart starts to soften a little bit. He starts to recognize what it is that Buddy was about and starts to learn the lessons that quite clearly this movie is designed to teach us. It's a fun movie. If you want to watch it, go to town. I'm not usually a Will Ferrell guy, to be honest. I'm not usually that guy, but it was good. Yeah. So Buddy is really really kind of a contemporary example of what it is that John the Baptist did. Both of them lived outside of normal society for a long time. Both of them, when they came back into what we would consider normal society, looked different, act different, think different, dress different. Both of them had different values and different understandings, and both of them had lessons that they knew or felt like they needed to show the rest of us. And they were both successful, first and foremost, because we took notice, because the people around them got curious about who they were and what they were about. They saw that they were living differently and began to listen in a way that they most normally wouldn't. Because the truth is, most of us like our routines. We know what we know, and we like knowing what we know. And quite frankly, let's be honest, most of us don't really actually want to change how we think about things. It's very convenient to continue to think about things and believe the things that you've always believed and just continue to believe them. That is the least amount of work you can do. Encountering new ways or new thoughts or new ideas actually takes energy and effort on our part, and oftentimes we don't want to do it. We like our routines and we like our structure. So when we come to a season like Advent, where God intends our routines to be disrupted, intends for us to remember the great disruption that his Son coming to this earth was, intends us to remember that and celebrate it and remember what it means to us, and to have that thought in our head about what is it that maybe God wants me to learn or think differently about this season, we can be resistant. So sometimes we need somebody in our lives who's going to behave a little differently than we expect, who's not going to fall into the same routines we fall into, who may help us learn something new. Now you may say people like this, people that go to these sort of extremes, do not exist today, and these are great stories, but John happened 2,000 years ago, and Elf is a movie. Well, as we say in this time of year, hold my eggnog. Let me tell you something. So I want to introduce you to somebody. His name is Antiochus Machus. And if you have not heard the name, I'm not surprised. So Antiochus is actually from Colombia, and he was a mathematician and a philosopher. He was a PhD, and in the early 90s was actually the president of the National University of Colombia. In 1991, he helped draft Colombia's first constitution, and was well respected in that regard. Now, if you know anything about Colombia in the early 90s, you know that there was somebody else who was probably a little bit more famous running around in Colombia in the early 90s. And of course, it was this guy, Pablo Escobar. He's the one they make the movies about. He's the one that's probably in the history books, if anybody is. And of course, he was infamous and really one of the first real drug kingpins at the time, and ran roughshod over that entire country in the 80s into the early 90s, until he died suddenly in 1993. He had a very strong and iron grip on that country. But there were those, Ananias among them, who thought things could be different. So at that same time in the early 90s, there were student protesters at his university, and he went out and tried to talk to them and really couldn't get through to them and really couldn't find a way to get their attention. So he decided to do what is probably the most logical thing to do when you have this large group of student protesters in front of you, is that he mooned them. Kids, ask your parents what that means. All right. And believe it or not, he got in a little bit of trouble for this. He got into a little bit of trouble to the point that he actually got kicked out of his job as the president of the university, but he also got some notoriety for it. They wrote about it in the newspapers, and he kind of became a little bit of a local hero for this. So much so that in 1993, the same year that Pablo Escobar was killed, he becomes mayor of Bogota, which of course is in the center of that former Pablo world. right? It's one of the most infamous cities. It's one of the most difficult cities. It's one of the most corrupt cities there was. And he becomes mayor of that city in 1993. And he decides to take on all of these challenges with, shall we say, some unique ideas. And I promise you, everything I'm about to share with you is 100% true. There are pictures. One of the things that he does early on in his time as mayor is he decides to adopt this other persona known as super citizen and dresses up in a rather interesting outfit. So this is him. He dons a cape and tights and starts to wander the streets of Bogota. He picks up litter. He helps people cross the street. Right? He does all of those things that he believed a citizen should do to help make their city safe and clean, and does it in full view of everybody in these rather bright outfits. And of course, the newspapers come and they take notice and they write articles about it. And his goal is quite simply very clear. He wants to be the super citizen so everyone else will at least be citizens. Right? He wants to set an example, but he knows just walking around in a suit and tie picking up litter isn't going to do it. So he makes a spectacle out of himself and adopts this persona. And you know what? It works. This, though, is not his only intervention. As you can imagine, in the early 90s in Bogota, there are certain things that are going on. And one of the things that are going on is the local police force is not what you would say the most trusted group, right? And in fact, it's well known to be one of the most corrupt groups, if not the most corrupt groups in the city. So when he becomes mayor, the first thing he does is he disbands the whole group and fires everybody. Then he comes back and he says, I will hire you back, but first you have to do something. If you want your job back, you have to go to 2 weeks of mime school. Literally. He then deploys the mimes as traffic enforcement officers in Bogota, understanding and hoping that people will, one, take notice of the mime suddenly directing them in traffic, be curious about it, and perhaps take a minute to think about what it is that they are doing. Because of his interventions in the 4 years that he was mayor, homicide rates in Bogota fell by 70%. Traffic fatalities fell by 50%. Every house was hooked up to water and sewer when previously it was only 80%. And other things happened too. Actually, currently, the idea of mime police is currently being tried out and piloted in Venezuela today. Oddly, nobody else decided to imitate it. I don't know why that is. When he was asked after his time was over, why did you do this? What was this about? He had this really great quote. He said, innovative behavior, I like that word, innovative behavior can be useful when you run out of words. Innovative behavior can be useful when you run out of words. John the Baptist 2,000 years ago he knew he needed to adopt some innovative behavior if he was going to get people to notice what it is that he was trying to do. Jesus' ministry was successful as it was because John did that and prepared the way. And then, of course, if you keep reading the Gospels, you can read all about the very, shall we say, innovative behavior that Jesus himself adopted that made him noticed and made people curious about him. I'm not sure all of us today are called to dress in spandex and go out as the super citizen, and I'm really grateful for that. You don't want to see that. I don't want you to see that. But I do think, and actually fundamentally believe, that Christians, followers of Christ, are expected, and part of the calling is to behave a little differently than the rest of the world behaves. And I think this season especially, the Christmas season, which is so easily becomes about shopping and comes about, buying the right presents and comes about all the consumerism that comes with it, comes about going to the right parties and doing the right things and putting all this pressure on ourselves and others to make it the best possible thing that it can be, that everybody tends to fall into that trap today. Wouldn't it be interesting if followers of Christ decided to use this season a little differently. We are intended to use this time as a time of gratitude, a gratitude for what we have already received. We are intended to use this time in expectation of what God is going to do in the future. That's why we come back here every year. It's supposed to disrupt our status quo and our regular routines, not with more things to do, not with more lists of things to check off, but to remind us who we are, who loves us, who we are called to love, and how it is that we are meant to be in the world. Wouldn't it be interesting, and mightn't people be curious, if they found themselves around somebody who seemed to be in this season of busyness, acting far more calm than most people do, who was focusing on something else and something different, who was concerned not with the latest toy and who's got what and how big the Christmas tree is, but was concerned about how their neighbor was doing, how they were feeling, how that neighbor who lost somebody this year may be going through some struggle, and instead of avoiding that, went to that person that they cared about and loved and reminded them that they are cared about and loved. Christians are called to be objects of curiosity, even though we really don't want to be. Most of us do not want to be the center of attention, myself obviously excluded. Most of us don't want actually people to notice us. Most of us try very hard to go through the world and move through the world in a way that seemingly most other people do. Unfortunately for us, the example we have in Christ, the example we have from John, and yes, the example we have from Buddy the Elf, is that we are called to do actually something a little bit differently. And the different thing about us, and the thing that is supposed to make us different and make people curious, is our ability and willingness and dedication to love God, love our neighbors, and love ourselves. What if Advent was about that first and foremost? What if that was the first thing we were doing at the company Christmas party and at the family dinner, instead of getting in arguments with our cousin who happens to vote different than we do? We chose to love him and love our family, love our friends, love our neighbors, love God, and love ourselves. I think that's what John calls us to do. I think that's what we are called to do as Christians in this time. And if we do that, I believe people will notice, and they may actually get curious about why it is, while they're freaking out, you have a smile on your face. Maybe enough to figure out a way to have a smile on their face themselves. Amen.